Hello everyone, my name is Jillian, and I'm a senior psychology major at Guilford College. My honors thesis addresses hardships the pandemic brought, specifically loneliness, and how dogs have played a role in healing their owners during the past year. I appreciate you taking the time to learn about my research. This past year has been an anomaly in a variety of ways. However, the most glaring and painful characteristic would no doubt be the COVID-19 pandemic and its social, emotional, and physical impacts. But even before social distancing, isolation, and the pandemic, loneliness plagued us. Over 40% of elderly individuals in the U.S. describe themselves as lonely. However, loneliness is not isolated to one generation or one country. Almost 25% of Swedish citizens, 33% of those in the Netherlands, 40% of the Swiss population, and 60% of people in the U.S. all report feeling lonely. Furthermore, more than 20% of millennials in the U.S. report having zero friends. In Japan, prison is even described as an oasis due to the social network inmates build while they're incarcerated. There are fewer and fewer ways to interact with others in the modern age. Driving alone instead of taking public transit, self-checkout at the grocery store, exercise apps as an alternative to in-person classes, and religious live streams are only a few of the ways that we have accepted and even embraced contactless living. Not only do people suffer emotionally from feelings of loneliness, but social isolation is a silent killer. Those who are lonely have a 64% higher chance of developing dementia, a 32% higher chance of having a stroke, and a 29% higher chance of suffering from heart disease. Some doctors have even equated health impacts of loneliness to alcoholism. Books published over the past year have showcased the diversity of hardship the pandemic has brought. One children's book described isolation as separate islands, social distancing as bubbles that can't touch, connecting through screens as seeing the world through an airplane window, and virtual school as learning from a submarine. A different book focused on how individuals have adapted their lives to combat social isolation during quarantine, such as adopting 12 cats to feel less alone. Others have used photos to depict the eerie scenes of empty streets, shut down subways, and shuttered businesses. These images, juxtaposed with photos before lockdown, emphasize how almost every aspect of daily life shifted in March 2020. The narratives described in these books are a reflection of real-life experiences across the world. So how do we address this? Ample research has been done in the field of human-animal connection, and a variety of these studies have focused on the mental health impacts of pet interaction. Not only can pets have a positive influence on their owners, but for some animals, being a beneficial companion is part of their job. There are 4 main categories of how dogs interact with humans that expand beyond the traditional pet-owner relationship. The first category, commonly referred to as working dogs, are dogs that are trained to complete a variety of tasks that aid their human coworkers, such as search and rescue, and cadaver, explosives, and cancer detection. Service dogs, while similar to working dogs in many ways, are primarily concerned with the health and safety of their owner. Service dogs can help owners who are deaf, blind, diabetic, or prone to seizures, as well as those confined to wheelchairs, individuals with autism, and those suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. Therapy dogs, a third group of professional dogs, have been used to promote healing in clients and patients in a variety of settings, such as nursing homes, hospitals, and mental health institutions. Interacting with a therapy dog is associated with an assortment of mental and physical health benefits for humans, such as lower blood pressure and reduced anxiety levels. Emotional support dogs have many of the same qualities as therapy dogs, but they do not require the same amount of training. These dogs provide companionship to their owners and can be a source of unconditional love and comfort. Dogs of all ages and breeds qualify, but a mental health professional must recommend having an emotional support animal before the owner can register their pet as one. No matter the role or title of the dog, the results are clear. Interacting with dogs, as well as other animals, improves our mental and physical health. With animal-assisted therapy becoming more common, and an increase in professional dogs working in various settings, a newfound interest in how pets impact their owners' well-being has arisen. Furthermore, pet ownership itself has increased. In 1988, 56% of all U.S. households reported owning a pet. Today, that number is up to 67%. That means nationwide, we have 393.3 million pets, 89.7 million of which are dogs. Research has acknowledged that being a pet owner comes with its challenges, both financially and emotionally. However, the bulk of the research available points towards pets serving as a positive influence on their owners. With exactly 50% of all U.S. households owning a dog, this data helps researchers better understand the dynamic that exists between owners and their dogs. The vast majority of research on this topic highlights the benefits associated with owning a dog, such as an improvement in physical and mental health, satisfying one's need for autonomy, and adopting social roles. However, some studies also include the consequences having a pet may bring, such as traumatic experiences at the end of the dog's life, undesirable behaviors, guilt from not fulfilling the dog's needs, and financial strain. These studies demonstrate that being an animal caregiver comes with both positive and negative realities that influence one's subjective well-being. Despite the gray areas surrounding how animals impact their owners, individuals from various populations have expressed that pets are essential when human connections are lacking or missing altogether. For those who have experienced loss and are grieving, dogs can serve as a companion and encourage healing. Therefore, perhaps unsurprisingly, the loss of a dog can drive already vulnerable owners to suicide. One man who survived his attempt explained how detrimental his dog's death was for him. "She was the only thing in this world that viewed me as someone worth loving. I sleep in the park, and everyone that walks by thinks I'm worse than a stray. I am subhuman. No one cares about you when you're in a situation like mine, except for her. She cared for me, and my whole life's purpose was to care for her in return. Now she's gone, and I have nothing left in this world." So what happens when human connections are no longer possible in the ways that we are accustomed to? The current pandemic has made individuals feel isolated, and in turn inspired a dramatic increase in pet adoptions nationwide. Additionally, researchers know from past pandemics and natural disasters that social networks serve as buffers for psychological distress. Researchers have found that people can experience higher levels of panic and depression while practicing social distancing. For these reasons, among many others, individuals are looking to their animals for emotional comfort, with some even adopting a new pet due to increasing needs for social support. Pets may seem like a safe alternative to human interactions, making them more tempting than before quarantine protocols were adopted. With more time at home, canceled travel plans, and kids frustrated with the realities of virtual learning, many families see adopting a puppy as a way to bring something exciting into their lives again. Since March 2020, numerous books, both for adults and children, have been published that specifically touch on raising a new dog during a pandemic. Books like The Day We Got a Puppy, Teaching Kids to Stay Safe During a Pandemic, Coliola, Courageous COVID Canine, and Puppy Palooza in a Pandemic use a story of adopting or fostering dogs as a way to teach children what COVID-19 is, explain how the virus spreads, and emphasize ways to help others during this time. Books written for an adult audience, such as Your Pandemic Puppy, Finding and Raising a Well-Adjusted Dog During COVID-19, focus on the logistics of adopting and the additional considerations associated with the pandemic. With more individuals looking to pets during a time of social isolation, how dogs impact owner well-being is crucially important. My research study will contribute to this field of knowledge by investigating dogs' role in influencing loneliness levels within the social condition of COVID-19. The first study addresses 3 core questions. 1. Does dog ownership status predict loneliness levels? 2. Is the degree of closeness in the human-animal relationship among dog owners correlated with loneliness levels? And 3. Is a human-animal relationship different for those who adopted dogs during the past year versus those who had their dogs before the pandemic? I hypothesized that individuals who are dog owners would rate themselves as less lonely than those who do not own a dog. Furthermore, among dog owners, I assumed a higher pet attachment level will be correlated with lower levels of loneliness. Finally, I believe that individuals who adopted a dog during the past year would have higher levels of attachment compared to those who adopted a pet previous to the pandemic. The second study examined why individuals chose to adopt a new dog during this past year and how their experience both positively and negatively impacted them. Now, possibly more than ever, society is plagued by the consequences social isolation brings. Animals could provide a solution, whether it be temporary or permanent, to feelings of loneliness. Research that investigates the human-animal bond could greatly improve therapy methods, in addition to providing the public a comprehensive understanding of how pets can benefit their owners. A year into this pandemic, our world has changed forever. If animals can positively influence us during this time of isolation, they could impact the mental health of a whole generation. The first study I conducted is called Emotions During COVID-19. An initial total of 210 participants responded to the online survey, but only 203 participant responses were valid. 3 entries were duplicates, and 4 failed to meet all of the informed consent requirements. Of these responses, there were 126 participants who identified as dog owners and 77 who identified as non-dog owners. The participants were recruited through snowball sampling by sharing the survey on public platforms. I posted the announcement in Guilford College's daily newsletter, The Guilford Buzz, and promoted it through my social media accounts such as Facebook and Instagram. I encouraged participants to share the survey with others, hence the snowball method. Of the valid responses, 80.3% were female, 16.3% were male, and 3.4% identified as non-binary. 46.8% of participants reported currently being married, and 44.8% reported being single, with 5.4% reporting being divorced and 1.5% reporting being widowed. The average age was 36.21, with a range of 19 to 80 years old. Household income varied widely. 12.8% reported their income in the first category, 4.9% reported in the second category, 7.4% reported in the third category, 15.8% reported in the fourth category, 14.8% reported in the fifth category, 19.7% reported in the sixth category, 6.9% reported in the seventh category, and 6.4% reported in the eighth category. The remaining 11.3% of participants preferred not to disclose their income. Out of all the participants, there were 19 U.S. states represented, with 51.2% of the responses coming from Kentucky, 22.2% from North Carolina, and the rest scattered among the remaining 17 states. To better understand each participant's living experience during the past year, I inquired about how many people live in their household and whether or not they are the primary caregiver for children. The average number of people living in participants' household was 2.9, with the range of 1 to 10 people. Additionally, the majority of participants were not parents or primary caregivers. I also wanted to know more about their COVID-related experience, so I asked if they had had to quarantine by themselves and if they had tested positive at any point. The majority of participants had not experienced quarantining alone, with only 28.1% answering yes. Additionally, only 7.4% of participants tested positive during this past year. The online questionnaire began with a page titled Emotions During COVID-19, with a short description that thanked them for their interest and explained the general premise of the study without divulging the true goal of the research. It then transitioned to informed consent, which listed participant requirements and researcher contact information. This section also guaranteed that participant data would be kept confidential, assured that they would be given an explanation for the research at the end, reminded participants that they could withdraw from the study at any time without penalty, and emphasized that their participation was exclusively voluntary. Demographic questions, which were designed to evaluate patterns and responses based on participant identity, came next. The survey then led into the UCLA Loneliness Scale. Afterwards, the questionnaire transitioned to incorporating the role of animals by asking participants if they currently owned a dog. If they answered no, the form was submitted. If they responded yes, they moved on to pet ownership description, which asked how many dogs they own, if they had lost or adopted a dog during the pandemic, and provided a space for them to include any other details about their relationship with their dog or dogs. The Monash Dog Owner Relationship Scale, also referred to as MDORS, was then used to measure the level of closeness in the human-animal relationship. After that, participants who reported adopting a pet during the pandemic were invited to be interviewed about their experiences. Those who were interested then provided contact information in the following section. Finally, the survey concluded with a debriefing statement that explained the purpose of the study. The two scales used are the UCLA Loneliness Scale and the MDORS. The Loneliness Scale includes 20 questions that address social interactions, feelings of isolation, and levels of perceived interpersonal support. Higher scores indicate a greater level of loneliness. This scale has been used in various other studies and is considered the gold standard as far as measuring loneliness. MDORS includes 28 questions divided into 3 subscales: dog owner interaction, emotional closeness, and perceived cost. For my study, I only included the first 2 subscales, totaling to 19 items. The first measure the study examined was levels of loneliness. To be classified as lonely by the UCLA Loneliness Scale, a participant must score 43 or above. Total loneliness scores for each participant range from 21 to 74, with an average of 45.63. Of the 203 people who completed my survey, 57.7% qualified as lonely. To test the first hypothesis that individuals who are dog owners would rate themselves as less lonely than those who do not own a dog, an independent samples t-test was used to analyze the data collected from the loneliness scale. Participant responses demonstrated that dog owners had significantly lower average loneliness scores than non-dog owners. The difference between the two groups was statistically significant. However, the effect size was weak, with dog ownership only accounting for 2.8% of the variance in loneliness levels. To test the second hypothesis that among dog owners, a higher pet attachment level would be correlated with lower levels of loneliness, a Pearson correlation coefficient was calculated. The human-animal relationship was scored using the first 2 subscales of the MDORS, where lower scores indicate a lower degree of closeness. Correlations with loneliness scores were not statistically significant for either subscale nor the 2 combined. Even the questions that addressed similar themes were not correlated. For instance, question 4 on the loneliness scale, I lack companionship, and question 14 on the MDORS, my dog provides me with constant companionship, did not have a statistically significant correlation. Finally, to test a third hypothesis that individuals who adopted a dog during the past year would have higher levels of attachment compared to those who adopted a dog previous to the pandemic, I used an independent samples t-test. Neither subscale nor the two combined provided statistically significant results. The MDORS question with the lowest average response was question 3, how often do you take your dog to visit people? Meanwhile, the MDORS question with the highest average response was question 9, how often do you have your dog with you while relaxing, i.e. watching TV? Since my second and third hypotheses were not supported, I wanted to consider the possibility that the support for the first hypothesis was due to statistical error. While dog ownership status appeared to predict loneliness levels, I wanted to verify that there were no other hidden factors that might account for these results. In order to do this, I examined the possible demographic differences between dog owners and non-dog owners. Gender remained around the same percentage for both groups. However, marital status differed between the two categories, with dog owners primarily being married and non-dog owners primarily being single. The chi-square test of independence was significant for marital status, with 12.9% of the variance accounted for. Another difference was primary caregiver status. Among dog owners, 42.1% reported being the primary caregiver for children, while the same was true for only 13% of non-dog owners. The chi-square test of independence was also significant for primary caregiver status, with 9.9% of the variance accounted for. Dog owners were much less likely to have to quarantine by themselves during the past year compared to non-dog owners, possibly due to their respective marital and primary caregiver statuses. The chi-square test of independence was significant for having to quarantine alone, with 7.8% of the variance accounted for. There was also a difference in age between dog owners and non-dog owners, with dog owners being significantly older than non-dog owners. Additionally, there was a difference in household income between dog owners and non-dog owners, with dog owners having significantly higher incomes compared to non-dog owners. All of these differences caused me to question if dog ownership was truly why there was a difference in loneliness levels among these two groups. I wanted to better understand the other factors that could be influencing the results, so I examined age and household income. Among all participants, age and household income were significantly and negatively correlated with loneliness levels. The same was true for dog owners alone. However, among non-dog owners, age and household income were not significantly correlated with loneliness levels. To determine the relative contributions of age, income, and dog ownership to participants' reported loneliness scores, I ran a multiple linear regression. A significant regression equation was found. Non-dog owners scored 0.071 points higher than dog owners, and loneliness levels decreased 0.008 points for each year of age and 0.035 for each increasing income category. Both age and household income were significant predictors of loneliness levels, but dog ownership was not. Despite the data only partially supporting one of my hypotheses, I still found fascinating results that may shed light on how the pandemic has impacted people all over the country. Perhaps the most disheartening discovery was realizing that, on average, my participant population would be considered lonely. When the UCLA Loneliness Scale was developed in 1978, the original researchers collected scores from a sample of 492 participants. The average total score was 38.9. More than 40 years later, scores have increased significantly. As previously mentioned, a participant with a score of 43 or higher is considered lonely. The average total loneliness score for the participants in my study was more than 2 points above this threshold. Whether the increase was caused by the pandemic or simply a reflection of our increasingly lonely world is unclear. The pandemic has no doubt impacted a variety of social activities, but there were signs before 2020 that loneliness was increasing. While owning a dog did not ultimately predict loneliness levels from a statistical standpoint, this study showed that age and household income do. However, this correlation was not true among non-dog owners. One potential explanation is younger dog owners with lower incomes adopted their dogs as a way to combat loneliness, while older dog owners with higher incomes adopted their dogs because they felt like they were at a natural point in life to do so. For younger owners who had not yet reached a stable point in their lives financially, there is greater potential for obstacles in the way of being a dog owner, and therefore the reason for adopting would most likely have to be important enough to outweigh those challenges. The degree of closeness in the human-animal relationship among dog owners was not correlated with loneliness levels, but it is unclear why. Past studies have examined the role of attachment and have had mixed results, making this relationship an interesting possibility for future research. In this particular study, the disconnect may have stemmed from the different contexts surrounding the UCLA Loneliness Scale and the MDORS. Participants most likely answered the loneliness questions regarding human connections they do or don't have, while MDORS specifically asked about the connections they have with their pet. This potential explanation is supported by the fact that questions on both scales that address the same topic, such as companionship, are not correlated. I purposely had participants answer questions related to loneliness before there was ever any mention of dogs. The purpose was to investigate whether or not participants considered their dogs when answering the loneliness questions without any prompting from the survey. When I promoted the survey online, I was also careful not to mention anything related to dogs, and instead focused on the emotions during COVID-19. If I had randomized which scale came first in the survey, the results would likely be different. Participants who answered questions about their dogs first would presumably take their pet into greater consideration during the section on loneliness, since a relationship had already been highlighted. The difference in the human-animal relationship between those who adopted a dog during the past year and those who had their dogs before the pandemic was not statistically significant. A possible explanation for this is that the MDORS did not pick up on key aspects of owning a dog during a pandemic. Some questions, such as how often do you take your dog in the car and how often do you groom your dog, could both be positively and negatively influenced by the COVID-19 protocols. The question that received the lowest average responses focused on visiting people, something that is difficult and often dangerous during a pandemic. Meanwhile, the question with the highest average score involved relaxing with your dog. These are excellent examples of why MDORS scores must be examined through the context of this past year. More than likely, participants answered low on the first question mentioned, not because they don't want to take their dogs to see others, but because they are unable to see others with or without their dogs right now. Therefore, the low score does not indicate that the human-animal relationship is not close. Instead, it reflects the environment in which the relationship exists and the social limitations that have accompanied the pandemic. Similarly, participants may have answered highly on the second question mentioned, not because they actively choose to relax with their dogs, but because they have limited options. They are unable to leave their house or invite people over as much, and so they are left with spending time at home and seeking companionship from their dogs. These explanations are only possibilities, but it is important to remember that the pandemic could have altered the results in unanticipated ways. There were several limitations in this study, such as its non-experimental design and snowball sampling. Without conducting an experiment, it is impossible to determine causation. Furthermore, participants were recruited online through snowball sampling, which does not ensure that the sample was representative of the general population. There are a lot of directions future research could take that would highlight important aspects of this topic that this study was unable to. For starters, doing a similar survey but examining the difference between cat owners and non-cat owners would be very interesting. Some participants reached out to me after completing the survey and explained their disappointment that there was not a section dedicated to cats. While cats also provide emotional and physical comfort, I chose to focus on dogs because they are more commonly used in animal-assisted therapy. Future research might also limit the participant population to specific demographics, such as college students or people with children. Either of those examples could provide greater insight into the differences between dog owners and non-dog owners, because the wide range of ages would be largely eliminated. The second study I conducted is called You're Not Alone: Experiences from Dog Owners Who Adopted During the COVID-19 Pandemic. A total of 26 participants volunteered to be interviewed, but only 21 interviews were completed due to scheduling issues. The participants in the study were part of the larger population who took part in the quantitative survey, so they were recruited in the same way. Of the 21 who were interviewed, 76.2% were female and 23.8% were male. Over half of the participants reported being married, with 42.9% identifying as single and 4.8% reporting being divorced. The average age was 38, with a range of 19 to 62 years old. Household income was spread relatively evenly among all categories. These participants came from 4 U.S. states, with Kentucky representing 66.7% of participants, North Carolina representing 23.8%, and Michigan and Ohio each representing 4.8%. The average number of people living in the participants' households was 3, with a range of 1 to 6 people. Similar to the survey participants, the majority of the interviewees were not parents or primary caregivers. In regard to their COVID-specific experience, only 9.5% of participants tested positive and had to quarantine by themselves during the past year. All of the interviews were conducted over Zoom between January 29th and February 20th, 2021. The interviews consisted of 7 questions listed here. Before I began my first question, I verified that I had permission to record the interview. The goal of these questions was to better understand pandemic adoption trends and to capture information about the pet-owner relationship I was unable to ask in the quantitative survey. The results for the qualitative interviews revolved around these 5 topics. The first question inquired when they adopted their dogs, and the results spanned almost the entire year. New dog owners adopted their dogs over the course of 11 months, starting in February and ending in December, with March and April being the most popular. The second question asked them to specify the motivating factors surrounding their dog's adoption. There was a wide range of answers, including having more time, being home more often, and wanting new energy in the house. However, the most common answer had little to do with the pandemic. Almost half of the interviewees mentioned adopting a dog because they wanted to fill a hole that their previous dog left behind when they passed away. When asked what the best thing was about having a new dog during a pandemic, the participants made it clear that their dogs had brightened their day-to-day life. For some, they provided a sense of purpose again, and a lot of companionship. Others noted being able to see a living thing grow and change over time to help measure the days of quarantine. Unconditional love and structure were also brought up, as well as the physical benefits of having a new puppy. Some participants also mentioned that their new dog distracted them from the chaos and sadness that surrounded those early months of lockdown. As far as the most stressful aspects of adopting a dog during COVID, financial stress, loss of productivity, training, and new vet protocols were all mentioned. However, socialization and separation anxiety were the 2 themes that stood out. When asked if they had noticed a difference in their emotions before and after adopting their dogs, almost everyone said yes. One participant said maybe, and one wasn't asked the question due to her particular adoption situation. The majority of participants noticed other people they knew adopting as well, with some even mentioning that their social media pages became flooded with pictures of furry additions as soon as the reality of the pandemic set in. Others admitted that they had adopted after someone close to them recommended it. The most comprehensive part of the interview was when I asked if there was anything else participants would like to share about their experiences. Some noted how emotionally uncomplicated pets are and how they are natural healers. Others explained how it felt natural to be a pet parent and that they couldn't imagine a life without dogs. Despite the different anecdotes they chose to share, the majority of the participants expressed that it was more difficult than they had imagined, but that it was definitely worth it. The interviews were eye-opening. Hearing from so many owners who chose to adopt during the pandemic allowed me to better understand the root causes of the adoption trend during the past year. Losing a dog was a main motivator for so many people, yet it doesn't directly relate to COVID-19. However, many of the participants who mentioned this as a factor noted that they had planned to wait before adopting another dog, but then ultimately decided it was the right time after the pandemic hit. While talking about the best things owners associated with their new dogs, many owners mentioned their new pet filling in gaps that would traditionally be up to friends or family. For instance, companionship was the most popular theme. Numerous participants mentioned not wanting to come home to an empty house and not knowing how to spend their time now that they were unable to hang out with friends and see their family in person. Adopting a dog seemed to be the perfect solution for both of these issues. Additionally, their pets provided a daily routine and a sense of purpose, both of which were lacking at the beginning of the pandemic. So, in almost all of the cases, pets gave their owners something to love and a reason to wake up every morning. As far as the stressful aspects mentioned, socialization was a major theme throughout the interviews. This challenge is understandable given the emphasis on social distancing and dog owners not being able to interact with each other in the same ways they were able to before the pandemic. Another common theme was separation anxiety, which can be explained by dogs getting used to their owner spending so much time with them. The interviews demonstrated that, for the majority of participants, adopting a dog changed their emotions for the better. Whether or not there was a quantifiable, statistically significant difference, the owners felt like they were better off after adopting their dogs. With the overwhelming, chaotic, and scary pandemic looming over us this past year, every indication of physical, emotional, and mental improvement is a win. When asked if participants personally knew other people who had adopted during this past year, an overwhelming majority said yes. This could possibly be explained by how trends like adopting a pet can become a domino effect, especially when people have more time to pay attention to those around them and tools to take in information quickly like social media. Furthermore, the interviews supported the idea that many individuals and families were eager to try what they assumed would quickly improve their mental and emotional state, since so many activities that would normally cause joy and excitement were impossible. These interviews illustrated the diversity of experiences that come with a new pet. However, each person I interviewed agreed that the good outweighed the bad. Both studies highlighted the complex and unique experience this past year has been. Together, these studies illustrate the role dogs have had this past year in the lives of their owners. Both highlight how the pandemic has impacted people differently depending on age, income, dog temperament, socialization opportunities, and vulnerability to loneliness. The results shed light on the unique pandemic experience and offer a snapshot of loneliness levels within the context of COVID-19. In the first study, age and household income were identified as predictors of loneliness among dog owners. Older participants and those who reported higher household incomes were overall less lonely than younger participants and those who reported lower household incomes. Dog owners need to be mature and financially stable to properly care for their pet, meaning that those who already meet these requirements have fewer obstacles in the way of adoption than those who don't. Therefore, younger people with lower incomes might need a more significant reason to adopt, such as overwhelming feelings of loneliness, versus their older, wealthier fellow dog owners. The second study examined the pandemic adoption trend more in depth and discovered a series of themes across the 21 interviews. Motivation to adopt primarily stemmed from the loss of a dog. The best aspect about adopting were companionship and motivation to exercise, and the most stressful parts were socialization challenges and separation anxiety. Furthermore, the majority of participants agreed that they had experienced a positive difference in their emotions before and after adopting, as well as noticed others, either personally or on social media, also adding pets to their family during the past year. Finally, the sense among most participants was that this experience was much more difficult than originally anticipated, but that they would do it again. There were two definitive takeaways from this data that have broader implications and warrant future research. One, more than half of the participants qualified as lonely, and two, owners who adopted perceived a significant improvement in their emotions to be a direct result of this decision. This research can be applied to better understand the complexities behind the pandemic adoption trend, as well as highlight the benefits of animal-assisted therapy. Limitations include the inability to suggest causation and using snowball sampling. Additionally, the small sample size of 21 participants in the second study didn't allow for as much variety in responses as a larger sample would. Future research could evaluate whether or not cat ownership is a predictor of loneliness levels and specify the target population to help control for confounding variables within the demographics. Additionally, interviewing the same individuals a year later to check in on how their dogs are doing once the world presumably restores social and professional norms would be a very interesting metric. There are a variety of reasons why people continue to include pets in their lives, both in professional and personal settings. A commonality among all these reasons is that dogs seem to make human lives more whole. Dogs both do and do not impact their owners in ways I predicted, but the fact remains that dogs change their owners in one way or another. I am still an advocate for animal-assisted therapy methods because I truly believe animals have the power to heal us. So, can dogs cure loneliness? I knew going in I couldn't answer this question, both because my correlational designs couldn't determine causation, and because the issue of loneliness goes beyond the capabilities of any animal. Though they may try, pets may not be able to fix every obstacle we run into, and the pandemic may have been just too large, too complex, and too painful to be solved solely by a dog's companionship. However, these studies showcase the stories of countless participants who believe their dog has changed their life for the better. Dogs provide a sense of purpose, structure, and unconditional love, all of which improves their owners' lives. Dogs may not be the only answer to how individuals have maintained their mental and physical health during this past year, but for some, they have meant the world.